All right, so this is the final day of Barry's epic DDoS resiliency workshop. It's been a great week so far. So I'd like to welcome you all to the final day. Looking forward to the content for what's really been a wonderful tutorial so far this week. Just before we start, I want to thank Internet Society for being our technical training partner for this week. Really appreciate that support. Otherwise, over to you now, Barry.
Yeah, thank you. All right, let's go ahead and I need to first make sure I'm pinned up here. There's the pin, and then do the share screen. Make sure it's all optimized, and then here we go. So, and then while everybody is, let me do this real quick. Drop the links to the presentations for today into the chat so everybody can follow along. So thanks everyone, coming again. I think our current sit rep, and you'll hear a little bit about this right in the beginning, the introduction of the first hour. The war started. It's a full out war. If you were listening earlier, Philip and I were talking, the cyber aspect of it is expanding fast. As we, like for instance, where I work, we got executive orders from different countries who are saying, here's the compliance for the sanctions. And then people say, oh yeah, we just, we want, they think it's a bubble. They think you draw a little circle around the cyber problem. And we're trying to explain to them, says, no, this is spreading all over. There, you're not going to get attacked from Russia. You're not going to get attacked from Ukraine. There's people in Russia who will attack you with resources all over the planet. Right, so this is it's going to be an interesting wake-up call, because as this continues to escalate and evolve, everybody here should, after this session, you can use these slides and materials to go back to your bosses, and you should be pulling together work streams, work teams to go out there and do things, because that's what we're doing. I'm very tired right now because I'm up at 6 a.m. in the morning after teaching at night. I'm in California, and 6 a.m. in the morning, we're got teams working on different threads of activities. We're not panicking. We're trusting our team. We're encouraging, collaboration with our peers. There's some industry actions that are going on. So a lot of the big edge operators and cloud operators are working together with service providers to do some preemptive action out there. So there's got a good collaboration. What I mentioned yesterday about trust groups, they're very active. And we're, fortunately for me and where I work, good top cover. Management is giving everybody time to get focused and get the job done. So that's kind of good with it. But this is kind of like, model of a crisis team. This is happening in like peer organizations, like parallel to where I work at Akamai, but we got streams working on the DDoS, we got streams working on ransomware, we got endpoint protection, we got new materials going out to our customers to help them beyond from what we do. We have press, media, communications, all that, multiple swim lanes and all coordinated together. This, as I'll point out at the end of this introduction, everybody needs to do this, because one of the things that I'm kind of really concerned about is the multi CCERT, national CCERT advisory rhythm of release is intense. I mean, we had 2 of them today, right? We had, one of them with like, hello, the Iranians are taking advantage of this situation, which is logical, because if you have a crisis where everybody's paying attention to A, and then B will jump in there and get through the back door to achieve their national means. And then we have like, oh, the US National Security Agency found a bug and reported to Cisco. And so that was like one of our teams. We were walking through that to make sure we had all our devices all plugged up, right? Everybody here who has Cisco, you should go through and say, if I have Nexus boxes on the network, you should be pulling together a team and making sure you have what I taught yesterday with the doing the anti-spoof ACLs. You do that within the device, with I think on Nexus it's COPM, the control and management plane protection mechanism, right? You do that sort of thing, and then look at other, like if you have Juniper, Arista, other boxes to do the same thing with it. All these materials, tomorrow I'll push up where we got it on APRICOT, and then I'll also put it up where it's over here on this one particular site where I put all my DDoS materials. And there's probably going to be some other DDoS preparation materials I'll pop up there so you can have that. What we covered on day one was these two sessions, right? So now the materials are up there so you can see it if you want to show it. So take advantage of this. APRICOT is under, like other ops meetings, under a spirit of empowerment. The videos don't go away, right? And even if they go away, we kind of like preserve them. Like for instance, SGNOG, Singapore NOG, they couldn't afford, they didn't have a budget to keep the videos up. So they told all the speakers and we copied them down. And then, I posted up to my YouTube page. We do that intentionally so that way you can teach your people around you, right? Your teammates. You can teach new young engineers coming in who work for you, right? You can say, go watch these videos. Let's go bring your team in and watch it together and discuss the different techniques of how you can make things better, right? So this is kind of like the model to tap into it. The next day we covered, responding to DOS attacks, talked about source address validation, the hard realities with it. It's doable, but there's hard corner cases you have to work on. We covered the DDoS runbook, the playbook, and then don't neglect the authoritative name server, because authoritative name servers are getting hit. They're part of the Russian miscreants playbook, to be explicit right now, right? So, they'll map out the name servers and then whack them down and then stop the attack and wait for it to recover and whack it down again. Very disruptive, right? Then we talked about protecting routers and switches. And we have an advisory come out on another router to switch, issue, and then how do we build these coalitions and things like that, right? So that's the aspect like that. Oh, Philip is saying all those Slack notifications, by the way, is all the correspondence with Ukrainian. That's a whole security trust government Ukrainians. I'll just turn my Slack off. Can't do anything to that. So thanks, Philip. All right. So, and then today what we're going to talk about is, having meaningful conversations and then the executive leadership. But right before we get into that, I talked about life intensifies. If you have a big issue that, a whole bunch of people in the community or the world are looking at, like in this case, a war in Europe, then other state actors who also have a conflict, it's an opportunity for them to say, what could I do to take advantage of this for my state interest, right? So the Iranian government, the Iranian threat actors are doing something, right? So this is an advisory, go read this. I read through this, it came out today, I read through this and went like, okay, we got work to do tomorrow, right? So I'm already kind of dissecting, what to do, for us to do any checks that we need to do. Because even though we have really, really good security in our company, we never take anything for granted. So we take an advisor at this and we'll go out there and say, okay, what did we miss anything? Let's assume we missed something. What we'll go look for? And we go look, right? And that's being prudent. And then this one we did today, which was, well, not this one, but there's another one on the Nexus one. I didn't put the Nexus one in. The Nexus one we did today. This was last week, with the Sandworm and the Cyclops activity. So go look at these, and as I recommended yesterday, one of the things to do is go to each of the 5 national security, CISA sites, CISA, NCSC, in UK, NCSC, and New Zealand, the Australian one and Canadian one, and sign up to their advisories. Very, very good material. And it will, I think it will, it helps us. It will help you too. So that's the quick introductions. Now for today's session, meaningful conversations. This is a presentation I keep on iterating and updating. I'm updating this by putting both vendors and ISPs into it. because I'm putting this in the shoes of a organization who has your ISP as a vendor. And then I'll be integrating in future versions where it's the vendor, ISP, and cloud, right? So it's like what questions do you ask them? And the idea with it is to empower a executive or a manager or a director, somebody who's not a security person, and even somebody who is a security person, to call in their partner, right? The supply chain, the vendors and the operators and the people to get services from. You call them in and you say, let's have a conversation. And the conversations will help two things. It will help, one, educate you, because they'll teach you what they do. And two, you'll find out really how clueful they are. Because even though you may not be an expert on fuzz testing, you'll have a pardon the English, a BS meter. You will know when they're kind of like BSing you, right? And it will help you make a judgment. Okay, what do I do with this relationship as a supplier, as a vendor, and things like that? And it's a data point. It doesn't mean you throw them out of the network, because sometimes there's a cost benefit. Sometimes you have ongoing contracts and can't throw them out. Sometimes, there's all these different factors with it. But to have that knowledge of saying, okay, here's where they're at, is powerful with it. This is all listed out in a document I maintain. I'm going to be updating a version of it. So I'm going to start adding the ISP part of it and then the cloud one into it. So that way you can go whenever you're ready, or you have your staff do this, you can delegate it to one of the people on your staff. They just go print it out and they sit down and set up a series of meetings with the vendors. These regular sort of things with it. You got to go on with a set expectation though. Can a vendor actually absolutely secure their devices? No, they can't. So you never can, if some vendor comes in and says, oh, our devices are totally secure. Okay, that's a big red flag. They can't, right? What you're looking for is how do they respond and how much work did they do to actually clean up the bugs? That's the key thing. How much work did they do, right? Can the same thing be done with ISPs, who you get your internet from? Maybe, all right? They can do a whole bunch of things with it. And so we'll ask through those questions, a few of those questions, so you can kind of like get an idea of how those upstreams are. So when you want to partner with them, they're part of your DDoS partnership. And why did this really matter? Because, people, the bad guys get into your network, right? You just have to assume the bad guys are going to get into your network. Next week, we're doing a panel session. And I'm asking a bunch of people about dire consequences of DDoS. How bad can it get? And before the talk, I was syncing up with Damien Mencher, who's from Google, and we're talking about different ways to actually, get people to look at things differently. This point here that bad guys can get in. And he liked an exercise that they do. And I want to do this where I work, but I've done this in other organizations, where you go up to somebody, you don't tell them it's a training exercise. You go up to somebody and says, we have indications that the bad guy, advanced persistent threat, is in this system that you work on right now. We need your help to go find them, all right? So we're deputizing you as part of our security team to go find them. So this is usually me as running one of the security teams in the company, and then we'll go tell them, here's your job, go find this. Now, we have no idea whether there is or not, right? We're just saying, please go do this. And they don't know it's a training exercise. Every time that I've done that, I have a small team of engineers. They'll look at the systems they work on, within it, and they come back and says, we found problems. We go, oh, really? They found problems. And we'll find threat actors stuck inside the network with all the defenses we have on. That's what this point is. That's the world we live in today, right? That's your network today, right? And it was interesting that Damien I compared and says, they find the same thing. The same time they run this exercise, they find things that they never thought they would find, right? And that's a good exercise we'll write up to so people can use inside the organization. What we see right now in the world, right, is indicative of it. The Ukraine conflict is just going to be all over the world. It's just spread. It's just spread out with it because there is no borders. You can't You can't contain cyber war within a physical boundary. It's all over the planet, right? And right now we're in a peak cycle. So when you go through your peak cycles, one of the things you do is, as you prepare, and this is something I'll talk about for executives, if you're in a leadership position in the next session, don't try to like do too much. You do what you can do. What tools do I have right now? Because I have a pending crisis right now. What can I do right now? Simple as possible. But then you'll come through and say, here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an idea. So in the swim lane call that we have in the company I have right now, we have this spreadsheet, or not a spreadsheet, but a Google Doc, which is our scratch pad. And everybody's dumping ideas in. And then we're picking off, says, okay, here's what we need to do right now. We need to go out there and write the test procedure and test this to make sure this particular feature works like we think it's going to work. Let's run that test. But you know, we could make that function better, but not now. All right, let's write down how it could be better. We write it down, right? So you got this dual track of what can you do right now, because you're in a peak, you're in a crisis, and then you document these really good ideas that people come up with for next, because those are the sort of things how you then, when it calms down, and it will calm down, you go out and make these big improvements. So be ready for the next time, all right? So you get these through these crisis cycles. And always, always remember, focus on the person, right? Packets are not attacking. People sitting behind computers in Russia are attacking. And now you got like what I saw, the anonymous crew, you know, or somebody claiming to be anonymous, are now declare war against Russia. So now you're going to go in both directions. And of course, people, just like civilians in a town with shells flying over it, you can get packets flying through it, right? But focus on the people, because they're the ones that you have to think about that are attacking you. The gun isn't attacking you. It's the person pulling the trigger on the gun that's attacking you. We got our threats that we talked about before. I classify it into 4 areas. The cyber criminals, we know, they're well understood. They have the behavior pattern. They're out to not to take out the internet. They're out to make money, right? So they do different things to take money. You got the nation state, right, which we're seeing with the war. Then you're going to have political activists like the anonymous crew standing up. Can't stop them. They're going to do that. You got more out there. You got a consortium of security professionals in Europe who are banding together to help Ukraine. Okay, is the European Union organizing it? No, it's a bunch of industry professionals who are doing it, right? Okay, so that's that political, patriotic, protective group. And then you have your subcontractors, the corporate threats. And there's a bunch of subcontractors that are out there, right, that will actually do it on behalf of the nation state interest, right? So this is kind of like our threat vectors, they evolved. But are there consequences? So this is something I did quite a number of years ago. This was 2016, I think, or 2014. So in 2014, this is kind of like data breaches. So I had a whole bunch of damage for data breaches, right? And what I was trying to demonstrate during a talk, it says, here's all the data breaches for a particular year in 2014. And then what I did is I mapped it through what was the economic consequence of the data breach. So I went out there and took like eBay, Home Depot, JP Morgan, Anthem. And the red line on there is the time of the breach. And then this is mapped against their stock price. So think about this for a minute. Got the red line, big in the news. Oh my goodness, eBay. Disclosure, bad news for eBay. And when you look at it, its stock really didn't go down at all. And then you look at it later on, over a year later, and it's up. You look at Home Depot. Oh my goodness, all this individual personal information got leaked by Home Depot. Okay. How high is the stock later on, a year later, right? So there, when you have these security issues hit companies, one of the things that, this is in the next section with the executive side, that part of your preparation is more than just good DDoS defense. Because the common denominator with eBay, Home Depot, JP Morgan, and Anthem is they had really good PR and marketing departments. They had executives who knew how to handle a crisis. And so when the crisis happened, they knew how to make sure to give their teams the space to get things done. They did the right things to take care of the victims, right? The identities that got released. And they trusted the market, and the market rewarded them for their actions. So, don't fear, that this is going to be a disaster when you get hit. It's not if. These days it's going to be when you get hit. But know that, there is, if you do the right things, you're going to get recovered. And this is a good slide to show your bosses if you're trying to get justification to say, look, if we do the right thing, everything is going to be better. Let's do the right thing, right? But there's another factor going on. Regulatory consequences are being ramped up in different parts of the world. In Australia, in United States, in Europe, in UK, there's a chain of consequences, of cost consequences, and they're being ramped up. And that ramp up is going to be, will impact you because it's a liability chain, and who's liable with it, right? So that's one of the things to kind of be mindful of. So as I mentioned before, the way I view security, it's like a hurricane and you live in Florida. It's going to hit you. It's like a hurricane. It's like a tornado and you live in Oklahoma in the United States. You're going to have tornadoes. Just plan for it. It's going to, if you're in San Francisco area like I am, plan for an earthquake. You will have an earthquake because this is where we're at. Or now fires, right? Now the fire problem is exacerbated to the extreme because of the droughts going on there. So the key takeaways is that, the risk is going to persist, for the next few decades. It's not going to go away. The market forces isn't a way to drive it away. There's a massive security ecosystem, all right, that you can leverage. And the liability is going to increase over time. Like when I originally wrote these bullets in 2014, I knew it was coming. Now I see it in action. So it's the requirements that we have as a company has dramatically increased since 2015. All right, and just view these problems as a force of nature. So what do we do for having meaningful conversations? Let me walk through some of these questions here. I'm doing this kind of like as a checklist format. I've mentioned this before. Here's a link to the TED Talk. Watch the TED Talk with Atul's TED Talk. Great TED Talk, gives you introduction. The book is worth having. As I mentioned, it was really helping to transform the discipline and how people did things in the Silicon Valley area. So it's talking about medical. Is quite interesting book. So we use this. So this is kind of like a checklist format, right? So the meaningful conversations is we got lots of standards, compliance guidelines, certifications, and a lot of times you get lost. Like I gave a couple of examples of these national CSRTs posting information out, and you can get lost. You got to really read through it, right? Because they pack a lot of information in, and a lot of them as government security professionals who have not been in industry and had to take what they just wrote and do something with it. There's no incentive to help them make it better, but it can get better. So what you do is you have conversations around it. Same thing, these sort of conversations. So this is kind of like a tool that you can have with it, and it's worked out. I've taught organizations back when I was doing consultant work, here's what to do, and it's really helped those organizations have these a greater mindfulness of what their risk is in their supply chain. Core thing with it is schedule regular meetings. Like you say, okay, if I'll pick on Cisco. Okay, I got Cisco in my network. Cisco, we're going to have a monthly meeting. And a monthly meeting for the next couple of months is we're going to talk about security. So you bring in the right people for security because we're going to ask tough questions. Here's some of the tough questions we're going to ask you. So we need you guys to teach us how these things work. All right. So make it regular, make it a nice rhythm. So this becomes part of your process. When you ask the questions, ask them, don't put it in PowerPoint and don't just come and wing it and speak to us. Write it something down. Here's a question, write it down. Send us white paper, send us documents, send us something, right? That's important because when they're forced to write it down, they're forced to actually think about it, to look inside the company and find out if it's done. Because sometimes the company may not have it figured out and written it down. And it pushes them to actually write it down. So now you're influencing their security posture because now they have to write it down for you. That's going to benefit all their other customers. Because you push that question, all their customers are going to be benefited and they benefit from it, right? So ask them to write it down, send to you, all right, so you can read it. The other reason you want it written down, because you're in Asia Pacific, is for the vast majority of people in Asia Pacific, English is the second language, and the dialogue will be in English. So it's nice where you have something written down in front of you, right? That's one of the key things with it too. So, don't be afraid to ask for writing. As somebody who's been in vendors many different times, and I'm Akamai's kind of a vendor, not a vendor. We're a service provider, edge provider, security provider, right? We still do the same thing. I always push to people, says, oh, they asked a question, I'm going to go get on a call and talk to them. I said, no, write it down. Write their questions down, write our answers down. Then we go meet. So I'm always in this practice where I'm at today. I do the same thing, all right, with it. Don't expect perfection, right? Because it's a conversation, right? So don't expect perfection. The conversation will make things better. As you converse, what they come in the door with, and you start talking about it, what they leave will make things better because you had a conversation, right? And then ask the vendors if there's a big gap. You say, can you come up with a plan? How are you going to fix this? And they come up with a resolution plan. So this is kind of the guiding principles of the conversation. So you take the first conversation. The first conversation is, how do they fix vulnerabilities? If there's a vulnerability out there, what's your process? How do you fix it? What's the process? Let's see your process written down. How do you determine that this is a critical vulnerability? This is not a critical vulnerability, right? And that's really, really important. On their website, do they publish, how do you report a vulnerability? Like if you find a vulnerability, how would you report it? These are the sort of things to ask. Do they have a 7x24? If I call up and say, hey, I found a vulnerability, will they respond to you? And how will they respond, right? So those sort of questions are really important to understand that, kind of like how they handle the bugs, the security bugs, So, and there's interesting things you'll find as you ask the question. So you ask vendor 1, vendor 2, vendor 3, you kind of get a good idea of this. So you can ask this question, they're going to educate you. You don't have to know anything about vulnerability disclosure. You don't have to know anything about, how do you handle a vulnerability disclosure workflow inside of an organization. They will teach you. You don't have to go to some class for it. You ask the question, they will teach you, you'll learn more. Every person on this, every organization that's on your supply chain that you ask about this, you're going to learn more and more, which is really cool, right? Then you continue with that whole vulnerability aspect of it is, what is your process? How do you fix it? When you find a vulnerability, how fast will the code come out, right? That's an important question to ask, right? I remember when I went from Cisco to Juniper, and Juniper rebuilt the security incident response team that does vulnerability management. One of the things I hammered out is to really speed up the speed of when we find a vulnerable piece of vulnerability to the time where we get code out the door on Junos, really, really shorten the time period down. And we did like a 90% reduction in time to get it out by working with the processes. Then we wrote down documentation to teach our customers, right? Which they still use today. The CERT team uses that document that we did. So if you bring Juniper in, they'll say, here's this document, and the document was created, many, many years ago, right? And they have no excuse with, oh, we don't know how to do this, because all they need to do is go to the first.org, www.first.org. The processes are all there written down, right? And there are people in the first organization who will come in and help them. Any other vendors in the first organization, they have a responsibility to help their peers, even if their peers are competitors, to actually build up these processes and procedures. So there's no excuse for not doing it. Then you ask in conversation 2, says, okay, how do you develop code? Do you have a security development lifecycle? Not a software development lifecycle, because people get confused. There's a security development lifecycle. How do you make sure when you code, it's not vulnerable, right? And, Microsoft was one of the first ones who said, we have this whole process. They have, books, materials. It's pretty impressive, the Microsoft SDL process, right? And you see on here, there's the 3 illustrations I put on here. You got Microsoft at the top, then you got Juniper, then you got Intel, the other one's Intel, right? And you ask the questions to say, okay, if you find a bug, like, do you do a RCCA? What's your root cause corrective action? What's your process for RCCA? Now, some people say, oh, we have a RCA. Okay, so you have a root cause analysis. How are you going to fix it? That's why we do a RCCA. What's your root cause corrective action, right? We want to find out what's going on with it, not just analyze it, but we want, you as somebody who is, this is part of my network and my solution, you want to find out about it, right? Then you continue on this, how do you do code? Do you do test-driven development? And they'll look at you, what's test-driven development? The salespeople have no idea. They have to bring in a specialist and they'll teach you things. Do you use dynamic analysis testing? Now, this is the sort of stuff that if you get no answer, you go, oh, all right, are they actually testing code? Is the code even tested before they release it? So that would be like, the reports coming from UK where they had the joint Huawei UK security testing sort of stuff. That was one of the things that kept on going. Is like Huawei wouldn't even test their code, and there was a big push to get them to test the code. Just very simple questions from this. Some of these questions I got from them from reading their reports. Then you continue this and you say, okay, do they do fuzz testing? Do they document the risk, right? Do they do unit testing? Do they have a test lab? Oh, what did they do in the test lab? You just keep on having these conversations and you see how they respond with it. So then you got the next one where you say, okay, do you have a bug bounty program? Do you do post-mortem work? Do you do pen testing? All right. What do you do when you, if I send a security team in, do you open up your source code for inspection? Now that may not be you, but if somebody comes in and says, yeah, we, the UK team comes in once a year and they inspect our source code, or we contract a team to come in and do source code analysis to look for things, right? And that's an important things, that ask with it. Do they participate with you in joint exercises? And this is really important, right? Because you want to use tabletop exercises as one of the tools to test all your processes, tools, procedures, your playbook, right? Make sure your DDoS playbook and your ransomware playbook all work well, right? So the UK NCSC actually has some good guides on how you build those programs, right? So this is kind of like the illustration they do for, they got a big white paper. Here's how you put together a cyber exercise. And so you go to your vendor, you go to the ISP and say, are you willing to be part of my cyber exercise? Who will you send? Oh, I'll send the account manager. No. This is not a sales opportunity. I want the engineer. Send the engineer in, right? So this is why you ask the question like, oh yeah, I'll participate. Good. Who are you going to send, right? So this is another one of those questions where you don't have to like be an expert and have to create it. The NCSC guide that they put with this is really cool. When I discovered it like last year and they published it out there, I looked through it. It says this. I was thinking about writing this. I don't need to write this. I'll just point to their work, right? It's good work there, right? So the other thing, and these get to the hard ones. And as we saw with a log4j, a log4j vulnerability, which was an open source widget that was in all over the place, and it's going to take a long time to get it out of the code. Organizations get into this trap. They get into this trap where they think that open source is free. And as somebody who's run an open source organization, when I was doing running an Internet Systems Consortium, I kept on telling people open source is not free. It is not free. Somebody has to spend the energy and the time and the brain power and hours and resources to make that code work. That's not free. Oh, they volunteered the time. Well, their volunteer time of a high-paying engineer who did good code is worth money, right? And if you want that code maintained and your business depends on it, then you have to support it. So looking at groups like Linux Foundation and other groups that does open source work is really important. But at the same time, you can help that effort by asking the vendors the question, or the cloud operators. Cloud operators are notorious for using open source code and not contributing to the open source community, right? And you ask the question, GPL documentation. So if I do a piece of open source code that's on the GPL license, you can come in and say, I want to get a copy of all the GPL code you have in your code. And you can request that. You have to give a CD, So like at Juniper, we had that. Somebody will write a letter, here's a process, we have a CD, here's all the open source code we have in Junos, right? So we write it down so people will know. Now that chart below was something that came out in 2019 where people were showing how many vulnerabilities there are in open source. And oh, by the way, you have to buy our tool, right? It's a vendor tool selling stuff. But the thing that's different is there isn't that there's more vulnerabilities in open source. It's that more people are dependent on open source and more people are looking for the vulnerabilities and finding things that have been broken for years. The Log4j.s has been out there for years, right? So some of the open source code, you look at it and you go like, that's been there for like 15 years, the bug, right? So because nobody was looking, but it was there. But rest assured, state actors, right? Or like Taifu. Remember I talked about the Taifu conference yesterday. Why it's so scary? Because the participants in Taifu competing, they find these things and they won't tell anybody. Oh yeah, I found this in this open source code and I can go in there and break into this mobile phone. And this piece of open source code has been vulnerable for 15 years, but I'm not going to tell anybody because I'm going to go to the tournament, I'm going to win, right? So ask the questions. So when you look at some of these other conversations, you say, are you guys willing to do joint reaction plans? So if something happens, we work together, whether it's a vulnerability or whether it's a DOS attack or things like that, let's build a joint reaction plan. Then you get into toughest questions. How do you handle in crypto? I did a whole long section in there of some of the crypto questions to ask. And some of the crypto questions could be like, okay, are you got PCI compliance? Are you got HIPAA compliance? Let's see the HIPAA and PCI test results because both PCI and HIPAA require audits and inspections on encryption, some of the encryption parts, different parts of it. And then you review their industry certification, like PCI, like HIPAA, like ISO 27 something something something, whichever 2700X function is out there, and you kind of look through the certifications out there. So you have these sort of conversations. Then you get into their supply chain. Okay, what parts are you dependent on? You built this router. Where'd you get all the parts? How do you know the parts aren't violated? How do you protect them to make sure that the ASIC that you went out and sent over to China to get built isn't violated, right? So you start asking supply chain sort of questions on their supply chain, not just you. By this time you get through this would be like 7 months, right? You do one a month, you have these conversations, multiple vendors. Your team and you are going to be really clued in. By having these conversations, you're going to learn so much. You're going to know which vendors and operators you have to worry about and which ones you don't. You're going to know even more questions to ask, right? And I love to give you other conversation questions to ask, to add to the list. This technique works. I got large organizations and telcos how to do this. They come out of it and they go like, the hell, no, they start teaching me, Barry, did you know about this? Did you know about that? Oh, I didn't know that. Wow. Where'd you find it out? Oh, we're having a monthly deep dive with this vendor. Wow, that's pretty cool, right? That's the benefit of this stuff, right? So this is a good tool. I put on this vendors, but it's vendors and the ISPs and the cloud operators. You can have it with all of them, right? And think about the next questions you have with it. Like for instance, how does your organization track down bad guys? what are some of the examples of your organization working with law enforcement to track the criminals, right? Ask, you'll think of more questions with that, right? So this material is all kind of like document, as I said. This is a living document, and we'll be we'll see over the next couple of next month as the war proceeds how much time I have to actually put into this. But the core thing with this, you notice that you don't have to be a security expert to ask these questions. That's the whole goal. The goal is to empower where a junior engineer can drive a meaningful conversation in a meeting. And that junior engineer, after several months of these conversations of vendors, will be like really plugged in, really educated, really learned about different concepts and different things going on, right? And they don't have to go to any conference to do that because the vendors are coming to you. You're the customer, you're the operator, you run the network, right? So that's the nice thing about it. And of course, the salesperson would be there trying to pitch alongside their experts, right? So that's kind of like comes along with it. Okay, now, what are the 3 things you ask specifically to an ISP, right? Straight up, MANRS. The nice thing about the MANRS, because you got to understand where MANRS came from. MANRS came from operators. So you look at the original core team that put together MANRS. I know all of them. They're all good friends. I've known all of them for like 20-something years, right? And they're all operators. At the time, none of them worked for a vendor. They all were working for big service providers. And they put together this list. And it shows a level of maturity. If you talk to your ISP and they can show you that they do these things, because don't expect remote target black hole if they're not doing like routing security. If their routing is crap, you don't want them doing remote target black hole. So it's like these things here, right? So so you list the things out there with prefix filter and route leaks, IP spoofing. You just go through there. What are you doing for route hijacking? There's a meaningful conversation in this, because as you go through a route hijacking, it says, okay, how are you making sure you're doing the protections? Are you doing RPKI? If you had to do a remote trigger black hole and the community list, right? All these different things kind of go along with it, right? You set up how do you making sure there's route leaks? How do you make sure, like, for instance, you don't have the Pakistan YouTube? So there was a case where the government of Pakistan told the ISPs you have to block YouTube. So they did a remote trigger black hole and they didn't have a Murphy filter. So a Murphy filter is what I call where for setting up your BGP filters, you have one that's your primary and one is the backup. So in case one fails, you have the backup. So that's a Murphy, because Murphy's law of network is something will go wrong on the network exactly when you don't need it to go wrong. And that's what happened to Pakistan, is they tried to do a black hole and they didn't have a Murphy filter and it failed the first filter and then out. And then all of YouTube tried to go to Pakistan and you had the outage because they didn't have the Murphy filter. All right, so that's an example of digging into this. You'll get the level of maturity of what they're doing with it. And then what are they doing for anti-spoofing inside the network, right? What they're doing for going out and finding things on it. So that's this session. So we got some good questions. Now's a good time to good questions. And since this is the last day, right, you got to remember this is a good time for everybody to kind of like, ask those questions. And it's a smaller group, all right? And we already have Jerome. Jerome, do you want me to say the message out loud or do you want to just do a comment? So he was asking, so he also is a ex-Cisco person, right? And he's talking about inspected of the different exercises listed here in terms of security practices. Some of this was actually evolved out of Cisco. Cisco would do this. Like Cisco has a product security incident response team. They have a security consultant team. So when you ask these questions to Cisco, they'll find the resources to actually come in there and empower that. It's other vendors you'll find that you go through a lot of difficulty. Huawei, ZTE were always difficult when I threw these questions at them. they would go like, oh my goodness, what do we do? Because they haven't thought through that. But at the same time, they would show up at the first.org conference, and then people would try to help them, right? So it's not like, because it's not good, solid, secure as much as you can equipment, and then having a process to respond is universal. Every vendor, you shouldn't be holding that back based off a national interest or competitive interest. It's the best interest of the industry is to get everybody's security posture as high as you can get it. So ask the questions. You know, you'll see the response part of that. So other questions? Has anybody ever tried to do things like this before? So, okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll break a little bit early, because we usually, the first session we go over. This one what we'll do is we'll come back like let's just do 15 minutes. So 5 after the hour. I'll be around, so we'll turn off the video and stuff like that. I'm gonna put the sessions in here again, so people can actually make sure they have access. Send to everyone like that, so that way they have it. And then you know, at right after the top of the hour, we'll come back and we'll do our last session of the week, and save up your questions and things. So let's go ahead and stop the video.